Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to wherever you're tuning in from. We have guests from all over the world today, so thank you for joining us. Today is the second in our PPP Webinar Series, and we'll be talking about preparing an effective brief that delivers. And before I introduce our speakers, I want to run through a few housekeeping points. So we'll be recording today's webinar and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards, as we do with all webinars. And also please submit your questions to the Q&A box, and then we'll have some time to answer them at the end of the discussion. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's panelists. So first of all, we have Nick Davies. Nick is a Regional Board Director at the Architecture Practice Broadway Malyan. Nick spearheads Broadway Malyan's educational portfolio in the Middle East and is involved with a number of PPP programs and initiatives across the region. And secondly, we have Morgan. So Morgan Belsher is the Infrastructure Development and Economics Practice Lead at Mott MacDonald. He has 20 years of experience across a range of sectors, predominantly transportation and infrastructure. And Morgan is currently the technical lead on 7 major multi-billion-dollar social infrastructure and accommodation PPs in the UAE and KSA. And thirdly, we have Stephen Lidington. Stephen's the Managing Director at Colliers Project Leaders in Ontario, Canada. So it's very early in the morning for him right now. Stephen has significant experience as a project finance advisor in infrastructure advisory, financial and PPP transactions, specializing in commercial strategies and financial structuring for complex capital asset procurements. And then we have 2 speakers from Cundall. Caimin McCabe is a partner within Cundall based in our Melbourne office, Australia. Over his 30 years of consulting engineering experience, Caimin has gained extensive PPP experience, both as a technical advisor as well as part of a bid consortia. And then last but not least, we have our moderator today, Richard Stratton, the partner and managing director, MENA at Cundall. In his 27 years at Cundall, Richard has gained extensive PPP experience, primarily in the healthcare sector. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Richard.
Oh, thanks, Annabelle. 27 years, God, that sounds like a long time. Right, so this morning our topic is preparing an effective brief that delivers with regard to PPP procurement. It's the second in a series of 4 webinars that we're running. The first one covered sort of general topics. The next one looks at the procurement process. And essentially what we're trying to do is, just to put this in context, is to say a public sector entity decides to launch a PPP procurement for a project. The public sector will generate a RFP or a bid document that contains a brief for what they want, whether it's a school or a hospital or a road or a bridge. And then the private sector has to respond to that RFP and specifically the brief. So what our panelists are going to discuss this morning is what is an effective brief and what's important about that brief and where the risks are. So without going on too much more about that, I'll launch straight into the first question. And Morgan, I thought I'd direct this at you. What do you believe the public sector want from the brief? So they're preparing it, but in terms of the outcomes they want from preparing their brief, what do you think they're actually looking for?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think just to sort of take a step back, referencing your previous webinar, you know, the strategic ambitions of these projects, really, from a brief perspective, are around encouraging innovation and efficiency through the design and construction, improved operational efficiency through the service delivery and quality of infrastructure, and optimization of life cycle costs. So, you know, these PPPs, the long-term nature of these contracts, allow that optimization of life cycle costs. So with that as kind of a background, that's the overarching strategy. So how does that manifest itself into the brief, and how do the public sector kind of transfer that requirement, that knowledge into the brief? And I've kind of broken it down into kind of 4 key areas, and also talking more widely about the kind of the overall RFP package. So clearly the package would include the clear and concise bidding instructions. So how bidders must proceed through the bidding process, how they structure their tenders, and critically kind of how they win, how they respond to the requirements according to the evaluation. Secondly, and perhaps most critically for the brief itself, is to provide detailed output-based procure requirements across all the project stages. You know, again, this is a 20 to 25 year concession, and that brief needs to reflect, you know, that period. But it also needs to leave this flexibility to innovate. You know, it can't be too prescriptive, the brief. It needs to allow that private sector innovation, flexibility in design, adaptability through buildings, and to leverage the kind of the experience of the bidding pool. And thirdly, it's to convey the commercial and legal arrangements. So the critical elements around how the brief will deliver the performance requirements of the building, the functional specifications, and then lastly, kind of maybe one of the critical things about the brief is to drive competitive tension through a transparent and fair tender process. You know, there really does need to be that competitive tension to drive value for money through the process, and to ensure that the public sector is procuring value for money advisors and concessionaire partners.
And thanks, Morgan, for that. I mean, that leads me probably nicely into the next question, which is flipping it the other way. And Caimin, I'll give you the opportunity to kickstart this one. Is taking on board what Morgan's just said, what do you believe the private sector want from the brief?
At the end of the day, what's outlined there by Morgan basically is the expectation that what the brief will give you. You want basically clear guidance on what the expectations of the bid responses are. How will they be judged, and also the parameters by which things are to be either evaluated, assessed, or modeled in terms of performance. That could be the financial parameters, the operational energy costs that need to be used to justify whole of life thinking. I suppose the other issue, I suppose, there is there's increasingly an amount of focus on performance outcomes. So you really need to understand how that actually will be evaluated by the, I suppose, the technical advisors that are there. And I would reinforce the fact that we obviously the expectation is that the quality standards and expectations of the functional requirements are actually clearly briefed, but there is actually some latitude there for that opportunity to innovate. We've tended to find that having been on both sides of the fence in terms of technical advisor as well as a bidder, being a technical advisor, there's an element of trying to encourage people to do certain things without actually necessarily explicitly telling them. So you're trying to look for those triggers in the brief that go beyond the brief, the things that will actually be the win themes for the bidders. And I suppose we've also found that there's indicators in the brief of where the state government, or in the case of in Australia, where they'd like some of their standard guidelines to be tested, or so looking at applying more evidence-based solutions than just a strict application of their guidelines or technical memorandums, so they can actually progress in that. So it's the evolution of the design of those types of buildings.
Okay, I mean, I just, between what you've just mentioned, Caimin, and what Morgan just mentioned, and Morgan actually used the term value for money. And having personally been involved in lots of PPP schemes that can get politicized, what does value for money mean? And I mean, I'll probably open this to, I don't know, Stephen, if you want to just jump in on that one, or, Morgan, Caimin, jump in as well. But, I hear the term value for money used quite a lot, and, lots of people have different views on whether PPP really offers value for money.
I'm happy to kick us off there and open the discussion. I mean, from a purely defined approach to VFM, it's the risk-adjusted net present value of a project. And so while we're in the design phase and preparing the public sector the brief on the document or on the project, we arrive at what our best estimate is on the NPV of the project so that we can get financing approved from Treasury, from the public sector to pursue the project based on the best developed estimates at that time, which then we filter through the P3 evaluation and we assess what type of P3 model we'd like to evaluate, and we'll evaluate a number of them against the public sector comparator, a traditional model. And from there, we overlay what our risk transfer expectations are, what risk sharing is, go through a process of quantifying each major risk relevant to the project. And from there, we assess how well or how poorly each contemplated model may deliver that risk transfer and risk sharing regime. And depending on the value of the quantified risks and how they're transferred or retained, we get a relative price from each procurement model evaluated, which is then the risk-adjusted relative price or risk-adjusted NPV. And the price that yields the lowest overall risk-adjusted price, so the greatest risk transfer, relative to the public sector comparator, the traditional model, that spread will be the value for money relative to the overall project costs. So I know that's a very transactional or formulaic approach to it. It's the sort of scientific one. But again, that's a financial advisor's view on VFM. So maybe Caimin and Nick can complement that a little bit.
Yeah, from a design perspective, I suppose the public sector comparator is ultimately what you get judged by. But having been involved in writing briefs, you tend to find that what gets asked for in a brief will generally be the upper end of what would actually otherwise be delivered if it went down a public procurement pathway. And in fact, it's not unusual for people to ask for more than actually they would even actually contemplate delivering in a public manner. So there's inherently the brief is pushing the boundaries of what can be afforded by the public sector comparator. So there's already a judgment call made with the brief as to if we get the brief, we've already got value for money. We've actually got return for that brief. There's an inherent expectation that I suppose the private side of industry can deliver things cheaper than public sector, and therefore they can get more for the same dollar figure. So that's my experience from that. I also think that there's that whole how to call it, it's very difficult because you're generally bringing a whole bunch of different organizations together under the same umbrella. So you've got the state government, you've got an institution like could be a hospital that's actually running, that's actually going to run the hospital effectively. And they've got very different mindsets as to what they're judging value to be. So invariably the brief tries to capture the mindset that's there as to what the expectations or aspirations are from the constructed outcome. And effectively your design gets judged by that, judged how it's actually delivered it in terms of the quality or the amenity that's been offered as a final outcome. That tends to be where I find it. It's judged from a kind of in terms of how have you met the brief and what else have you added to the project beyond the brief. We're also finding that there's increasingly now they're asking for what else can you offer above the brief? So giving prices for additional items, so things that aren't quite costed in the public sector comparator, what could you offer a cost for doing so? which is like an encouragement list of things to do that they want you to do inside the public sector comparator number to get more value for money from the bid.
And from my side, if I can just add that I look at value management as part of that as well. And, you know, if we're looking at a rollout of a number of projects, we may want to spend a little bit more on a particular material or something. If you're doing for one building, it's a little bit more, but if you're rolling that out over a number, you're going to get the efficiencies. And I think the value for money comes in carefully managing that side of things as well.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
So, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I'm just going to add my 2 pence worth on VFM. I mean, it's almost incredible to me the fact that it is so controversial and subjective, arguably, the VFM analysis, yet it forms the cornerstone of decision making around PPP. You know, I know in the UK, for example, you know, the PPP program has effectively come to a halt because of inherent bias and errors that the National Audit Office found in the original procurement of PPP through the VFM analysis. So, you know, you do have to be very careful in making, and as Stephen indicated, you know, that risk identification, analysis and allocation is pretty subjective, and you do need, you know, you need to get full shareholder buy-in as you walk through that process. And it's also, you know, potentially controversial, you know, some of the key risks that you might be passing to the private sector, things like construction delays, design changes. You know, government clients arguably don't want to accept that happens. So why would they need to transfer that risk? You know, so you're walking a slight tightrope if you're obviously government side advisory by, you know, telling a government client, you know, typically you deliver late, so we're going to transfer that risk. Sometimes they don't want to hear that. So bit of a tightrope to be walked.
Okay, no, that's great. I have a question in, but I'll save it from Ranju. I'll save it because we'll address it a little bit later, I think, but I won't forget the question. So Stephen, just kind of building around that, one of the things I wanted to ask was how detailed should the public sector brief be? And we've sort of touched on some of this already, but maybe build a little bit around it. You know, what should the key focus areas be?
Well, you're right. We have touched on some of the areas thus far, and I think that you know, some of the very important features, because the brief is really a teaser ahead of the actual RFP and project agreement that really lays out in very concrete terms what our expectations are from the brief at a more hypothetical stage, or at the outputs that the public sector really wants to achieve, versus what may or may not be practical in market. So in terms of, you know, answering your question on how detailed the brief should be, there does have to be some very specific language around the model that's been selected as the preferred procurement model. The risk transfer, specifically, you know, the major project risks that are identified to date, and how those will be transferred or treated in the procurement through the life of the project, and certainly the expected innovations that we're looking to achieve. The public need, the need for the asset, the objectives and overarching expectations of what the private sector is expected to deliver in this, which makes it a good P3 relative to what could have been done by a public sector traditional procurement. So kind of to Morgan's point of walking that line to say, this is a P3 with these parameters that we're expecting that the private sector is best suited to take on. And that is really based in the ideology that P3s are not meant or intended to transfer as many risks as possible. They're meant to transfer risks as appropriate, the most appropriate risks that are possible, those that are best managed by the private sector and can achieve meaningful savings relative to the financing cost that is incurred by taking on a P3. So those are some of the greatest importance issues that are meant to be addressed in the public sector brief. I would add that, you know, the need for the asset and the indicative design, so at a schematic design level, maybe a 35 to 40%, is approximately where we would expect to be at that stage. And let the private sector have loads of area for innovation and improvement and bringing the design to final, so that we can capture those efficiencies and that innovation. One of the last, I think the last point I'll mention is where there are some uncertainties, there may be some strategy being revealed in the document as well in terms of implementation strategy. You know, Caimin mentioned that there can be scope issues that may be included as a bit of a cash allowance or a scope ladder feature that may be in addition to the base scope of the project. So the nice to haves may be assessed in a strategic way, but those would also be very important considerations for the brief.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I would also add there that there's increasing amount of focus on environmental performance now being embedded into briefs in terms of actually tangible things, be it an energy target or a greenhouse intensity target that needs to be delivered from a performance perspective. And also operational costs in terms of actually determining what is the expectation of the cost of running the facility based on parameters that are given. There's also some quite interesting innovation stuff. There was a prison in New Zealand where there was actually in the brief, you actually had to, there was a performance indicator against recidivism in terms of how many people actually end up leaving the prison and coming back, which is it's a very interesting way of approaching a PPP. So, and created a lot of discussion as to how do you present how you're going to do this. So I think it's coming both ways. The brief is starting to become a little bit more inventive in terms of how it's asking for things, and bidders are having to become quite inventive and creative and just creating a different response to differentiate themselves from the other teams.
Okay, we've had a question in that says, should the government or the public sector provide a reference or concept design in addition to output specifications to guide bidders in a specific direction? I don't know who would like to answer that one. Nick, okay.
Yeah, I would say not a design, but I'm a great fan and believer of supporting the narrative with images and precedents of things that they like and what they've seen and what they aspire to, because that gives the consortium a really good understanding of where they want to go. But it also gives the consortium the flex to be able to come up with their own interpretation of that precedent. I think providing a design goes back to the comments already made about being just too prescriptive, because the concept design could have gone too far, not allow the consortium to come up with their own thoughts on what the vision is.
Yeah, I would support that, and that just giving an indication or a quality direction, I think, is really important, as opposed to saying here's a design, because then you've got to, if you move away from it, do you have to then defend that position? It starts to get a bit messy, basically.
Yeah. So
yeah, I agree. Those are good points. A vision rather than a design is a little bit of the objective there. I think from having from over prescribing is the challenge that we want to avoid there, to allow the private sector to deliver innovation according to something that may be interpreted in the RFP procurement phase, in the commercially confidential meeting, there may be design presentations that allow them, that allow the proponents to propose designs and get feedback and help evolve. But at the outset, to prescribe something is, it does tend to put this box around what might otherwise be a great area for innovation and achievement.
Yeah, and I think I mean, one of the things I was thinking, maybe just to add to that is, and I think Morgan touched on it earlier, the government or the public sector very often do prepare a reference design anyway. It's referred to as the public sector comparator, because that's the only way that the public sector can work out the initial affordability. So they can share it, provided they're not making it prescriptive, I think, is what everybody's saying.
I think as well that I think in the Middle East, classically, at least outside of utilities, we are dealing predominantly with facility-only PPPs, i.e. not providing the services. And in that case, yeah, a kind of a reference design that reflects the procuring authority service requirements. You know, if it's a school, for example, the procuring authority will have educational standards, pupil teacher ratios, etc., that they'll need to comply with, in which case you can probably go some way down the line to providing that reference design. Whereas the prison example that Caimin just mentioned, I mean, that sounds potentially like the prison guards and the delivery of the prison services potentially given to the private sector as well. And in that case,
not always. Yeah, it can be both. We've got both here, but the prisons actually tend to be quite unionized, so they've used the PPPs to break down some of that. Not to say that's bad, but it's more about actually getting the correctional officers aware that there are different ways of doing things. Just because it's done this way doesn't mean it's always has to be done that way. And they've used that to great advantage of actually educating effectively the operators that there are potentially better ways of delivering it. At the same time, they've turned around and actually said fully privately managed prisons. So it's a bit of both.
And I think just going back to the very original question around this about, you know, how detailed should it be? I think it's important to note that typically, well, almost in all of the ones we've seen in the Middle East, that brief forms part of the contract documents. You know, the brief doesn't drift away. That the brief and, you know, the procure requirement, the output specs forms a key part of the contract to be managed for 25 years. So, you know, you can't really rush this. You know, it does have to be thought about and be, you know, robust enough to be able to be used to manage that contract over the concession period.
You just raised there a very important issue, is the fact that there's a few failures. One in particular was a prison here, which went down the PPP path, but the successful bid team treated the project as a D&C as opposed to, no, this is the brief actually, as you say, lives with the project and ultimately gets referenced back to at all times to make sure you're still actually delivering. And that was the error that they made. They thought it was a case of they could just ignore the brief and just deliver a traditional D&C, which failed to deliver on the project.
Okay, so moving on then, and what I'll do is I'll address the question I referred to earlier that we hadn't asked. But Morgan, I was going to kind of direct this one to you anyway, which is what are the key risk areas in a PPP, you know, brief, and how should they be addressed? And I'll just add the question that Ranju asked, which is he's basically said, what are some of the major technical hurdles on the path to an effective brief? So more or less the same question, just wondering what your thoughts are. And I think also potentially bringing in something Stephen mentioned, which is around risk transfer and, you know, the fairness of risk transfer and what the private sector can manage and those sorts of things. I don't know if you could give some thoughts around that. So that's a very long question, I apologize.
If I take the latter part of the question first, and Ranjit's question, yeah, I mean, I suppose that the hurdles are kind of almost threefold. It's moving, again, talking, you know, public sector side and giving that advice to government clients. It's kind of moving them away from what they might have done in the past to relinquishing some control over the design, over, you know, how the building will function. It's you know, focusing the minds more on the kind of the delivery of the services within a structure. So that's kind of the first one. The second one is capturing it into output specifications. So again, identifying those kind of areas where the specifications can be looser or entirely vanilla for the private sector to come in. And then I suppose the final one is wrapping that into a clear and concise document that captures those output specifications and then that flows through into the performance regime and the payment mechanism. So, bidders can clearly see where they make an improvement and innovation that responds to the procure requirements, that they're then going to get rewarded for that, and they can see the reward, and through that they can also do that kind of optimization of whole life costing as well. Nick mentioned earlier, they can make decisions about materials potentially early in a process like this that might have a higher capital cost in the early years, but a reducing maintenance cost compared to a different type of material. And again, that's that whole life optimization, which ultimately will drive a lower unit price for the facility for the public sector. I suppose turning to risks, typically there's kind of 5 periods around time periods for risk. There's obviously the design process post financial close. There's always a period of taking whatever tender design has been done through to kind of final design and IFC, final design and approval, so that there is risk that sits in that process. And that's changes to design, errors that were made in design. And again, that one of the great things about PPP is that is fully transferred. Obviously, client mandated design changes not covered under that, but typically that is all covered under the public, the private sector. And again, at financial close, the procuring authority then knows what they're going to get. That's kind of locked down the price and exactly what they're going to get. The second stage, once that the design is finished, is obviously through construction. And again, a full risk transfer of construction related risks to the private sector here. And that will cover everything from delay risks, increasing price, delay of materials, unavailability of resources on construction sites. There would be some shared risks we would advocate during this stage. So things like permitting and approval should probably be a shared risk, simply because the public sector can support bidders in getting those risks. And during this stage, there's other risks such as ground condition, that typically would transfer to the private sector. The third stage then is the commissioning process, and I'll use a hospital here, which is probably one of the most complex commissioning processes, with all the equipment being brought online, the building systems and equipment, and then making the building or facility available for the procuring authority staff to come in, doctors, nurses, etc. And again, that whilst there is some shared risk in that, typically all of that commissioning risk and making all the building, the rooms, the equipment available would sit with the private sector. You then got the kind of the operations period, and again, risks transferred there around building availability, machine availability, and then the final part is the kind of the handback. And again, one of the key parts of PPP is after that 20-25 year concession period, you can hand back a building in an agreed form, so that the public sector receives back that building. They know that there's going to be residual life in the assets, residual life in the equipment. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we structure the risk, the process. I think Stephen quite neatly talked about the kind of the VFM and how the risk adjusted NPV is calculated, but hopefully that gives a flavour of some of those risks and where they occur in the process.
Okay, thanks for that, Morgan. And so just
Morgan,
probably...
Can I ask Morgan a question, Richard?
Yeah, of course you can, yeah.
I'm fairly new to PPP in this region, and I'm just wondering if the PPP has an improved the authority approval process in this particular region, because that's one of my bugbears is the process, and sometimes having the authority with you actually doesn't help speed up the process. Has it proven to be successful?
Yeah, I think that there are certainly examples where procuring authorities have really helped in maybe putting the foundations for smoother approvals at a later process. So they've invested in site investigation works, for example. They've done the early environmental impact assessment or scoping, such that those documents are readily available. The bidders don't have to go and do it. But also I've been involved in projects where, exactly as you described, having the authority involved doesn't always help. It is typically a key risk that would be identified at bid stage, and developers would be required to lay out their proposals for achieving those approvals, and then they would also identify which of those approvals would require the procurer to support.
Just adding to that, then, next question, Morgan. I mean, how have you seen any success in trying to get some of the statutory authorities as public sector stakeholders in the project, if you see what I mean? So rather than just being the very traditional process that I think Nick's referring to, where the bidder is dealing with the authorities in a fairly traditional design and construct sense, whereas if the public sector is actually able to get the utility companies engaged in, the original briefing and the RFP. I mean, have you seen any success in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly, in the utilities space where there are kind of tried and tested models and, clear frameworks that all the authorities involved, take the utility sector and PPP sector in Dubai, for example, very developed market. Everyone now knows what is required, and it's kind of a cookie cutter approach, for the new IPP, IWPP. I think in other jurisdictions, maybe this has started to become more streamlined with the creation of the body, the PPP body. So NCP in Saudi Arabia, ADIO in Abu Dhabi, the Ashgal PPP unit in Qatar. They are now, formulating guidelines which help to streamline this process. Doesn't always work out as per the guidelines, but at least there is now a clear path for bidders to follow. And at least all parties should be, aligned to that, shall we say? Yeah.
No, that's very insightful. So, sort of moving on, taking a slightly different direction, and I suppose if you consider this in the context of what we've all experienced over the last sort of 18 months to 2 years with this global pandemic, I wanted to ask how the brief can address future-proofing and technological developments. And Nick, I was going to kind of get you to start off with this, but I'd imagine it's quite an interesting subject for everybody, so it'd be interesting to hear everybody's views on this.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. I think it's probably already been mentioned in some of the discussions we've already had, and it's about the brief being flexible, or allowing flexibility by the consortium to suggest, offer, demonstrate technological advances throughout the design and delivery program. And that I think that technological development is not only from the designers, but it is from the full team, including the contractors, procurement process, the protocols, the cost consultant, MEP structure, and environmental was mentioned earlier, and particularly for the contractor as it gets onto site. I think it's part of the full team to contribute to suggesting ways to improve the technological delivery of this, but also allowing for that future proofing aspect that you mentioned. I mean, from my side, always look at the site side. If it's an asset we are designing, looking at the site and thinking 10, 20 years ahead to ensure that site can actually take expansion, take that flexibility that I mentioned. Is the infrastructure in place to allow for the technological advancement or even future expansion on the same site? So I think it's important to, again, we're going back to it, to allow that flexibility in the brief, to allow people to contribute.
Okay. I just pick, I mean, I know others will probably want to chip in, but maybe if I ask this as a follow-on to that, Nick, and you know, others can jump in and say what they think, because I've been scribbling down some things as we've been going. So you mentioned there, Nick, say things like building in flexibility, you know, for that future-proofing. I mean, this isn't always the case, but in my experience, quite often flexibility costs money. You know, so it increases the capital cost of the development, which the private sector will then have to capture in their affordability model. But of course, they don't have a sort of a way of offsetting that cost in operational benefit terms, because it doesn't reduce operational costs. So how do we align then the, you know, because I think it's quite important then that the public sector brief and the you know, recognises that, number one, or that there is actually a mechanism for rewarding innovation that can't actually be reflected in value for money in a, you know, kind of in a pure fiscal sense. I don't know, Morgan, if you know what I'm trying to get at.
I have to confess, sorry, I lost you a little bit there. Apologies.
What I was getting at was, if you build in, just taking one example Nick used, is if there's expansion or future proofing and it costs more money in the scheme to build it in, like, you know, additional utility capacity or additional space to accommodate something that might occur in the future, or we think might occur in the future, or maybe, say, for example, take the pandemic scenario, that are general in a hospital, a general ward area that needs to be very quickly converted to an intensive care unit. You might build in additional facilities that cost money, but of course, it doesn't reduce the operational costs, and therefore the unitary payment would go up. So how can that be captured in the assessment that the private sector undertakes of the public, that the public sector undertakes of the private sector submission, really? Sure.
I mean, I suppose this is, one of the arguable weaknesses in PPP, that, you are building, you know, it's a fairly rigid model. You know, what you procure on day one, you know, it's pretty much set for the future. You know, that there is potentially a ramp up of demand, you know, that can potentially be built in. But yeah, there is arguably you know, deficiency in PPP in that sense, and certainly pandemic's a great example. I mean, that has been covered typically by change in law through the change mechanism and a number of these PPPs. But obviously that's almost a band-aid, a temporary fix. You don't actually improve the facility or expand capacity. And I think, I mean, technological risk in this sense is, and equipment specifically for future-proofing is a real tricky one. You know, hospitals, again, you know, you buy an MRI machine now, and then you need to price for replacement of that MRI machine for 25 years. But how on earth can you forecast what the technological improvements might be around MRI machines? So, you know, there is. And I suppose it comes back to this fact that this is a partnership. You know, this really must be a partnership, and there must be the flexibility from both parties to deliver those output specifications and reflecting kind of current market conditions. You know, there needs to be protection for the private company, the sector, that they're going to make their returns, they're not going to get unduly hit. But similarly, there needs to be the flexibility that, you know, the changing face of whatever service it is that can be reflected and changed as time goes on.
Okay. I think those are good observations. Oh, please go ahead, Caimin.
I was going to add just there that what we're finding is that there's increasingly requirements around that future proofing to actually put dollar figures to things and actually explain things in more detail, both to protect the bidder and the the procurement, the procurer in terms of the actual what's on the table and why. We're finding, for example, that we halfway through a current PPP we're doing in Australia, the state government has come out to say they want to be net zero by 2050. That's thrown a curveball to the bid team. And on the previous PPP last year, they basically were quite loose on that, and they actually asked us to put price what would the cost be if we go all electric sometime in the future. How would that be done? So there's a kind of there's using those type of mechanisms we're finding to try and sort of evaluate the value equation to some of those future proofing attributes that the design has embedded. Equally, we're finding that it's easier to build an extra floor now than it is to actually add one later. So that's been becoming part of the bids to say we've put an extra floor in and we'll use it for other things. Or we'll basically leave it there as a shell for you to expand when we know you will, basically.
I think this is an important, and a very important topic in the delivery of P3s. Progressive P3s are something that are starting to include considerations for future proofing and expansion, and diminishing the rigidity of the contracts the way that they've historically been for about the last 15 or 20 years at least in North America. The overarching theme here to trend towards that progressive model is that P3s are not the best fit for a number of projects that do require ongoing evolution. Certainly heavily invested digital transformation in assets is very challenging. Think about P3s that might have been procured 10 or 15 years ago. They would never have been prepared for the technological and digital requirements that we use on a daily basis now. So there are carve-outs that can be carved out of major projects and said, oh, we'll manage digital strategy on our own or digital transformation. They operate on such short life cycles. So they're not always that compatible, but there are certainly some great examples that have been mentioned here. Energy is often a pass-through. Energy costs are often a pass-through in P3s, and so having GHG targets around that and trying to future-proof during the original procurement is the principal driver of having competitive tension around some of these issues that we've identified here.
Can I just add as well, Richard, that I think that the pandemic has been, I hope it is a wake-up call, because it's realized some things that, and if I reference some schools operation here, that I'm aware that some schools have been able to get back quicker because the flexibility of their layout allowed them to have multiple entrances and one-way systems to allow the kids to continue their blended learning and attendance at school. There are some schools that simply couldn't do that because they were so rigid in their layout that they're still closed to this day. So I think hopefully the authorities might appreciate, yes, there is a cost for the flexibility, but it can help in the long term.
Yeah. And I think, I suppose what we're saying is it is a kind of an evolutionary process, and it does come back to what was said earlier about effective risk transfer. And we have had another question, which I think we've answered, the example was around future-proofing. And Morgan, I think you touched on your example of an MRI machine, which I think answers the gentleman's question about how do you deal with obsolescence in technology. And I think what we're really saying is, and Stephen, I think you refer to the term carve-outs, is that there needs to be carve-outs in the brief that says, look, private sector, you obviously can't price for things you don't know, but show us your innovation in how you're going to deal with it. Not necessarily the price of it, but how would you approach it, I think is what we're saying.
I think that's a fair point. And also with that obsolescence year over year, ensuring that you're not overpaying for that. So those carve-outs being able to be matched to market at those refresh stages, which may be more frequent.
Yeah, and then one other question, which I kind of throw in, I'll read it out exactly as it is, which was, how I understand it anyways, the comments made that internal processes and due diligence for large-scale capital projects is generally quite stringent. And so my interpretation of that is we're talking about large-scale traditionally procured capital projects, not PPP. And then what needs to be done by the private sector to procure such projects. So I guess if you imagine a project that would have historically been procured traditionally, but it's now going to be procured through a PPP, I guess what the person's asking is, the public sector would have done a lot of due diligence, but will the private sector do the same due diligence? I mean, I'll kind of kick it off by what I think. And then if everybody else wants to jump in, I wouldn't necessarily agree for a start that these large-scale traditionally procured capital projects have always gone through very stringent due diligence, but that could be debated. But number two, largely the private sector are taking the risk on not doing their due diligence and therefore will pay for it. I don't know if people think that's a reasonable response, but I'd like to hear other people's views.
I think your point would be that it's, well, I'll say that it's an evolutionary process in any procurement model that goes out. If it's traditionally procured, then yes, the public sector may invest more in design and architectural and architectural design and construction drawings up front to hand it over to a construction firm to take it away. Versus in a P3, you're running maybe up to 3 concurrent phases of that design evolution through the RFP process in a P3. So I think that there is the transfer of some of that in a P3 versus that traditional model that I mentioned, which is kind of a design bid build. But there are also CM, construction management at risk, which includes a gross maximum price. There are other models in which you'd hand over some of that design and that due diligence work in the development phase as well. I'll leave it there. It's. I mean, the work has to be done one way or the other. But your point on if the private sector doesn't do it and they win the project without having done advanced geotech, these risk evaluation processes, they may get stung by it. I think that's an important observation that you made as well, Richard. Yeah.
I think if I could just add, I mean, I suppose on a PPP side as well, whilst it takes longer to procure the transaction, during that period, you've got this kind of triple layer of diligence, if you like. You've got the procurer doing their own diligence to go out. You've then got the developer managing an EPC contractor as another layer. And then finally, you've got the lenders sat behind a developer with their lender's technical advisor adding a further layer of diligence. So takes longer, costs more to set up, but you've got that kind of triple layer of diligence, if you like, so that when you get started, arguably you're in a better position to deliver the project to the output specs and within the timeframes.
That's a great point, Marian.
Right, yeah. So kind of moving on a little bit, and Morgan, I was going to direct this one to you, and I'm going to tag on a question that Caimin has asked. So my question was, with everything we've already discussed so far, what does a successful brief look like? And I know that's the $1 million question. And Caimin has said, and if maybe this just contextualizes it, which is what has been the most successful type of PPP model in the Middle East over the past 10 years. And if people are able to give examples, that would be great.
So, okay, I'll answer the last question first, if that's okay for Caimin's question.
That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, the PPPs in the utility sector, that they have an extremely strong track record. Almost every week there is a record-breaking power purchase agreement being signed, and why have those been so successful? Very tangible output. Is my power station generating 200 megawatts 24/7, 365 days a year? Yes, I get my availability payment. And basically through confidence in the transaction pipeline. There have been multiple transactions. There is confidence in the market. The international lending market is very active and confident. That we're now seeing no guarantees or lower guarantees than were originally required. So without a doubt, for me at least, utilities, those IPPs, IWPPs, and now renewables have certainly been the most successful. And responding to those kind of macroeconomic challenges, in this part of the world, they need the lights on, they need the aircon pumping to drive that private sector, to drive industry, to drive tourism. And so there's been no clear macroeconomic requirement that's kind of manifested into these PPPs. And you can see that across the whole region. That's not an isolated case. That has been across the whole GCC. And starting with Oman in 1984, that was the first IPP, which has now gone through a full cycle and has actually been handed back to the government and retendered. So hopefully that answers that second question. I don't know if anyone else wanted to chip in before I come back to your original question.
I was only going to make an observation, Morgan, and I might be wrong here, but I guess the social infrastructure PPPs are relatively new in the region, aren't they? So I don't think there's even 10 years, well, I don't think there's anything close to 10 years history in social infrastructure, PPP.
No, and again, I think there's a few things here, but one is arguably an intangible output. You take education, and we all know if you have a better learning community, a better learning environment, greater teacher pupil ratios, there is going to be an improvement in the general level of education. But very difficult to measure that, as against, as I say, a 200 megawatts being kicked out of a power station. So we have seen schemes fail in region where you take a scheme to a government minister to get signed off, and because the costs arguably in the FM part are higher because you're going to maintain the asset properly. You're not just going to build it, let it fall into disrepair and knock it down and build it again. You're going to actually manage that building. It's been rejected because they see I can do this cheaper outside of PPP, not recognizing those kind of full benefits. But I think we're now seeing a bit of a shift change. The We're Building Company Wave 1, that's 60 schools, that closed in February. Wave 2's in the market. Wave 1 in Qatar, that's been completed for schools. So we are seeing this pipeline developing in a number of healthcare projects. They are coming to market. They are bankable, sensible risk allocation, sensible contracts. So yeah, I think we will see many more.
Great. So then back to the original question.
Yeah.
What does a successful brief look like?
So I did a little poll of my team yesterday. We had a quick half an hour in preparation, so thanks to them for this. But we came up with kind of 7 sort of key areas, and we've broadly talked about them all on this call already. But really, we came up with kind of one of the overriding ones was fair. The brief has to be fair. The allocation of risk has to be fair. You have to recognize the private sector needs to make a reasonable return on this. They have to pay back the debt. They have to make their equity IRR. So that fair contract that protects the public sector, but also recognizes the private sector is here to make a return. That is key. The brief should be output focused, as we've discussed. This shouldn't be overly prescriptive. It should be outcome based and allow the private sector to generate the ideas, bring the innovation to deliver those outcomes. Where possible, it should be anchored on existing codes and standards. It's all very nice pushing the envelope on some of these schemes, but they have to be anchored in existing codes and standards then to ensure compliance when you go for your building permits, when you need to try and get those bits. The fourth one we came up with was achievable. So, some of the schemes we've seen, some of the highway schemes, arguably, that have failed in region, they're just too big. And, they are sadly too big, and they did fail. And so there just needs to be a bit of realism about building the pipeline. And Dubai Health Authority, their cardiology centre, the PPP that they're developing, is a brilliant example of a medium-sized scheme that is well suited. It's a nice lending value. The risk profile is great. It's not a 1,000-bed hospital, brand new, first one in region. So that achievability and realism is key. Two then interrelated ones was kind of keep the scheme as simple as possible. Use the simple language, and I think, as Nick said, use pictures, diagrams. That's a much better way of getting across, your requirements and those procurer requirements, than just adding volumes and volumes of text, which are difficult to interpret. Different people will interpret differently. And I think finally, I touched on it earlier, it's a coordinated scheme. So there's a clear flow from the output specifications into the performance regime, into how the payment mechanism works, and how the payment deductions or bonuses potentially might work. That kind of clear flow through the documents was kind of the final thing we thought, where arguably you don't see that clear flow. Bidders will price potentially that risk, which is obviously not what you want to see in that final offer. So that was what we came up with as a team, just as a quick overview of what we think should be in a brief.
Right, and I guess kind of moving to my next was, and we've probably touched on some of this, but it was just if anybody wanted to add anything. Stephen, I think I initially thought maybe you might like to, but what is there anything in particular that maybe we haven't touched on already that should be avoided in the public sector brief? Just those no-go areas that you just don't want to put in there, perhaps for the reasons that Morgan's already touched on.
And I think that Morgan and his team did a very fine job on brainstorming in those 7 points, and it does implicitly give a roadmap on what not to do a little bit, which an overarching theme there is to try to stay a little bit on market with precedents in the region, and not try to stretch the model out too much to be something that it isn't meant to do. So it is a rigid model, which works well for the right type of asset, but trying to apply it broadly to new areas where the market may not expect it, or may not see a natural fit, or may not be prepared to take on those risks, could lead to a failed procurement, because it is, as to Morgan's, I think, first point, that you want to keep it fair. You want to keep it something that the market will accept, that will readily be bid on, and you could qualify, a strong set of consortia to deliver the project. So what it shouldn't do then is deviate all that much from market precedents and what the market is prepared to accept. I think, and that's strategically for, internally, on the other hand, is that you do want to drive value out of it. So there are some things that you'd rather compete and develop some competitive tension around, rather than have open book. Specifically on costing, there are a number of strategies that can be brought to market if you set an affordability ceiling and just say, hey, this is my entire budget for the project, capital and operations. Here's my scope ladder. So you can have it really open book in that sense. And very briefly, a scope ladder will just identify all the items you would like to have included in the project and your maximum price that you're willing to pay. And with the competitive tension between the bidders, the more that they can achieve on that scope ladder, the more items they can include for the same price, the better they score typically.
Yeah.
An opposing strategy on that is to not reveal your affordability ceiling, and to have bidders really compete on that price quite stringently, knowing that they've got to outbid each other rather than just come in under the affordability ceiling. So those are the two overarching themes that I would say is, one is really internal strategy to go to market on how you'd like to manage costing. And the other is just to certainly make sure that you're sensitive and aware of the market and what they will accept, and not to deviate too far from that.
Right. I mean, I liked, that's really good. And I really quite liked its simplicity actually was really good. And bizarrely enough, I haven't heard it presented in this way before, Morgan, was when you said coordinated. I think that's a really important point. It's probably going to be one of the takeaways I'll take away today, because I know, having been on the public sector side, all the different specialists that come up with the great ideas, it might be coming up with the innovation, might be coming up with the design, looking at the flexibility, looking at payment models and all of that. If it's coordinated, so let's say a designer comes up with a fantastic, innovative solution, it needs to be coordinated with the assessment criteria and the affordability model and the payment mechanism. And provided it's all coordinated, then you're great, aren't you?
I probably would have used the word aligned, but yeah. Yeah.
So I think, so moving on a little bit, and well, actually, I suppose I'll kind of wrap it into this, because I was going to talk about how do you brief for innovation and avoid being too prescriptive, so that we don't stifle innovative thinking. So I think we've probably answered this, unless anybody, well, maybe not as effectively as maybe we could. So I mean, if anybody wants to add anything to that, I'll be quite interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Richard, I was going to talk about allowing sufficient time in the program for innovation. And I'll speak from experience that, we have made, as designers, we've made the decision of not pushing the envelope because the program was restrictive and wouldn't allow us to test buildability, materiality, innovation. So I think that's what stifles potentially the innovation, is not having a flexible enough program. And I know I've mentioned flexibility a lot, but I think the program as well, and we all know in this region in particular, the program is so key. I think that will help massively to push the boundaries.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a government advisory perspective, we do struggle with this. PPPs, even the best PPP processes, and in region, again, that's utilities, they take 16 to 18 months, best case, from inception to financial close. And that is in a well-trodden market, known precedents, lenders all warmed up. So trying to squeeze a new social infrastructure project down to 12 months, you're just setting out to fail. But yeah, and so we all I sort of always have this discussion with clients. Typically in region there'll be a tender period and then they'll extend it, typically, but you don't always know. But the argument we make is just set it longer. Don't play with bidders. They're going to need that time. And exactly as you say, Nick, that we're asking for bidders to return something pretty comprehensive, well thought out, well structured. Give them the time to do it. The longer you give them, within reason, the better your return will be, and arguably you're going to lose time then at the during the later design stages, because it would have gone on that stage further. So yeah, I sympathise with the bidding community at times with some of the timeframes that are allocated. It just why not just give a date that's reasonable to start with, instead of kind of keeping some time up your sleeve.
We were lucky enough in a PPP bid last year that the pandemic got in the way, which actually extended the program by about 6 to 8 weeks to allow us to work out how we actually continue to engage. And that actually gave that relief valve to the actual bid team to actually take the time it needed to actually evaluate some of the ideas it had. So we took advantage of that, and thankfully we're successful. But I don't disagree that sometimes it's incredible how quickly things have to be done, particularly with the whole engagement process, where you actually have to, you know, give an agenda for a meeting in 3 weeks' time to allow the review process of that agenda before you've actually had the meeting. And it's incredibly, you know, process driven, and you just need to give people time.
Yeah, I think that just also picking up on, as you say, program can stifle innovation because you simply don't have time to do it. The other thing I was thinking of when you were saying that, and I've experienced this in some PPPs I've been involved in, or PFI schemes historically, is confidentiality. You know, in order to test some areas of innovation, you quite often want to ask the client questions. And as we know, it's quite common in the region in particular that anybody that asks a question, everybody gets the answer. And also, if you do develop something, I have also experienced scenarios where your innovation's been, you know, either openly or, you know, inadvertently leaked to some of the other bidders. And of course, it's a USP for your scheme. I mean, do people have any thoughts about that and how we can, you know, maintain confidentiality around innovation?
We have found, I mean, that's a great point. And you know, the fairness and the transparency, you know, must be preserved. However, you know, the challenge there is if I have a really good idea and I'd like to speak with the sponsor about it, but it is a commercially confidential idea, and if it gets out, then, you know, I've shown my hand. You know, there is a process through which we've used in the past that identifies our questions coming in as commercially sensitive or commercially confidential, and they you know, depending on the response, whether or not it's a clarification of the RFP process, the question submitter can withdraw the question before it gets answered to everybody. So to be clear, there's no direct communication. I'm going to answer your question and then you can withdraw it. It provides a bit of an indication as to whether or not it is a fair question to be answered widely, and then it can be discussed in the CCMs in commercially confidential meetings, but not formally answered. And that therein, I think, is the real driving benefit of having the CCMs, is to have that open dialogue. It's non-binding, certainly without a transparent response to everybody, but it can certainly guide individual consortiums in the right direction of being able to capitalize on what might be a strategic factor for their win theme on the proposal.
That's great. And then last question, Caimin, I was going to sort of direct this to you because it's, I guess, an area of your expertise, and given, you know, our other great global challenge beyond the pandemic is our climate crisis. So I was going to ask you what's your experience in the effectiveness of performance targets and environmental ratings in driving more sustainable outcomes?
Thankfully, I suppose from my perspective, I found it to be quite good. But there's some key success factors. You do need to give clear guidance as to how the performance testing will be undertaken. and the benchmark methodology that will be used by the bidders. So you actually get things compared as much as in a like-for-like situation as possible. There's, again, which was touched upon earlier, about using industry standards and industry tools where they can be applied, they should be applied. We have a neighbours rating tool here in Australia, which in the UK is kind of referred to as design for performance. And that's actually that's applied to hospitals here in Australia. And that measures the effectiveness of your greenhouse gas emission performance and your water use, potable water use performance. So by using those types of tools, you're actually getting a solid grounding as to how things actually get tested and evaluated. But you do need to be a little bit careful. There are a few things you need to consider how you the effectiveness of the methodology you're outlining, or the phraseology that you're using within your actual brief. Because I suppose to a certain degree, it is a competition to win. So the bidders are looking for avenues by which they can identify opportunities to enhance or improve their bid over their competitors. A very good example of this is where, if you might say, oh, it's going to be easy, I'll just tell them to actually do the environmental modeling based on an environmental rating tool. And that might sound like a simple thing to do, and everything's covered. You might actually get unintended consequences. We have, an environmental rating tool here called Green Star, which is very similar to LEED and BREEAM in the UK. And it compares your greenhouse performance with a reference building and tells you how good you are, how many points you might achieve from doing that modeling. But there are some subtleties in the actual calculation methodology that the brief consultants need to be very much aware of. And for example, in energy and greenhouse, Green Star basically excludes plug-in and specialist equipment energy use, which for a hospital can represent more than 40% of the energy use. So suddenly, if you might think you have a challenging greenhouse intensity target that you're setting, in fact, it's actually not as difficult to achieve than you think, basically. So there's a I suppose the whole thing is, I think it's becoming more and more effective. It's more and more used as a tool to test the environmental performance, or the general performance of designs. We're starting to see that in ESD, or as we call it here, or sustainable design, is actually increasingly becoming very much a key indicator, a key evaluation target that has to be met. Even the level of reporting that's now being asked in terms of daylight availability, thermal comfort, views, energy and greenhouse performance, water conservation, climate resilience, etc., all being captured now in the briefs. So they're actually becoming more and more used as mechanisms to evaluate bids. And like everything, it's a learning curve. People are more and more increasingly using those industry tools to ensure that there's a solid basis to compare. So generally quite effective is my experience to date.
Okay, that's good. Well, I think we've pretty much reached the end of my questions. I don't know if anybody else has noted anything they wanted to add that I haven't asked. If not,
I suppose just one question, maybe for Nick, if you could. I suppose just building on what Caimin just said. We not struggle, but the Middle East is arguably behind the curve on driving environmental targets and sustainable design in region. We're one of the first things, as government advisor, when we say, let's go for a LEED, gold standard. The immediate question is, how much is it going to cost? What's the benefits? It's not, that's the right thing to do. That's the way the industry's trending. Yes, there will be benefits. So Nick, I don't know if what you're kind of, you're seeing that kind of transition in region from procuring authorities, or is it still kind of being dragged along rather than pushing?
Yeah, I think generally it's just lip service at the moment. There are not many out there that really mean it. But as designers, to achieve even a 2 Pro less Dharma, which is my local equivalent, like a lead silver, you know, you can go a long way just by good design and have the right team. It's not about plugins and bolt-ons at that sort of level. And that's what we're trying to encourage with our responses, that just give us the time and look at the solutions that we're coming up with. We can achieve these targets, because a lot of the RFPs we're receiving at the moment, they're still pretty low comparing what the rest of the world is aiming to do. And I'd personally love to be able to try and elevate that benchmark locally here, because it is achievable.
Yeah, that's a you know, Nick, you touched on a very important point, which is the sponsor support for it as a political ambition, for maybe lack of a better word, you know, versus just the kind of, you know, financial evaluation of it. In one of the recent P3s in Canada that I closed was a district energy facility and solution for heating and cooling, nearly 100 accommodations buildings, and it was really because of the political support for the political objective of GHG reduction that we were really able to drive through a meaningful GHG regime in the P3. Benchmarking, overall reductions, actual compensation regimes are in the evaluation on how far they were able to push down overall GHG consumption through the life of the assets, which I wanted to mention. One of the greatest hurdles that we're going to see and have seen in other P3s is the ongoing monitoring and validation of outputs on energy and energy reduction. We often defer to a self-reporting regime on P3s. So the P3 private project company is responsible for generating reports and submitting them for review on a frequent basis, whatever that frequency might be in that project. But independent validation and monitoring is also something that we've identified as a value over the life of an asset, just to make sure that it is maintained. There are a number of mechanical refreshes through the life of a P3, and making sure that those ambitious outset targets are held, because they do continue to be a priority of the sponsor, is something that we've found value in.
Yeah, I think that's the advantage of the PPP program here, is that it will introduce a greater level of maintenance that our buildings currently go through, and that maintenance allows that monitoring to be more accurate.
Right. I mean, what we're finding here, again, by using some of those industry tools like Neighbours, which essentially you are evaluated every year in terms of your score and your performance, they're starting to be used and applied. So the expectation is that you have to report, not just report, but have to rate. Now, it does create a very interesting conversation, because suddenly it's not all about everything the project code does. It's actually what the actual operator does. And that starts changing the thing, because we had an interesting conversation there on a hospital where we say, well, if you take 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions, 40 to 45%, we've got no control over. Right. And so if you're not going to come to the party, how do we achieve our performance? So, and that can be lawyers at 10 paces, or it can actually be a very proactive thing. And it turned out to be quite a proactive thing, because it actually suddenly realizes that, of course, we can't unplug your MRI machine just because we want to save the energy this week. It's not going to work that way. So how do we actually manage this together to achieve the outcomes? And I think that's where it's going to, in my mind, and we're doing this on a number of projects where we've actually been engaged after the event, because we typically only get engaged in the design, but actually to look at that monitoring and tracking to help people understand what was intended, how the building was intended to be used to function, and what the performance would be. And then can it continue to deliver that down the track? But also, how can it actually improve? because that's the other thing. It's not just about maintaining, it's actually how do you improve. So actually take step changes as you go along. So I think you're going to start to see that blending of the skill sets actually spreading into the longer stages of projects, rather than saying, right, my bit's done, I'm off now. I'll go on to the next one, basically.
So we're pretty much out of time. I've got one last question, so it'll have to be a quick answer, but it does kind of relate to what we were just talking about, which was somebody's asked, in regards to energy use, do you find that the incorporation of a pain gain mechanism is more effective at driving energy efficiency considerations for the bidder? So we've probably got about 1 minute to answer it. So yes, no's.
I'd probably say yes, but I think there's also an opportunity with the bidders if they can actually take financial advantage of the tariff risk, which they generally don't have to, because if they can get value of that, they can actually do some more innovative things than you would otherwise be asking them to do.
Okay.
I think from my perspective, just to build on what Caimin said before, typically in these facility-only PPPs, 40, 50, 60% of consumption is actually done by the public party. So you have very little control over that pain gain, really. Yeah. So yeah, I would say probably not in answer to the question.
Yeah. I agree. Energy is a tough one. It's usually a pass through to the sponsor paying for it. You can set targets, but above or below that target, it's risky to suggest that there's a pain share mechanism. And then if they're sharing their gain, they don't really try. It may not be enough of a yield. So give it all to them if there's a gain mechanism. And then equally, it's an all pain mechanism if it's one or the other. But that's I
think the opportunity with peak energy costs, which is where energy authorities tend to actually hit you hard with. You ain't going to get the benefits unless there's some form of sharing, because the value equation is there. So I think there's an opportunity. I don't think it's necessarily a closed door, but I think you need to find the right mechanism to do so.
Right. I think maybe, broadly speaking, energy storage solutions might unlock that in the future, but given current demand response, it's not necessarily something that provides tremendous advantage.
Well, for the benefit of the person that asked the question, we do have another 2 parts to this series of webinars, and the last one deals with the project delivery and operational side of things, and that's probably where we will explore some of these issues in a little bit more detail and probably spend perhaps a little bit more time discussing it. But what I'd like to do is very much thank you, the panelists, for joining us today. Nick, Morgan, Stephen and Caimin. I think it's been a great discussion, very, very informative, and I'd also very much like to thank the audience that joined, and I do hope that everybody's learned a bit more about PPP procurement, and the benefits of it and how it can be applied. So, Annabelle, I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything else.
There we go. Yeah, I think, as I said, we'll share the recording afterwards and uploads to our YouTube channel. And I think that's everything for now. So thanks again to all the panelists for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.